It's me again, James Brewer Stewart, James Wallace Professor of History at Macalester College, author of multiple volumes, teacher of many students, heavily retired and looking for things to do, which is why I decided to record this series. Thanks for watching. This is a world that we've piled on top of itself now, showing how all sorts of different levels of cultural and political and social tension come together, synthesize, and create the problems that we have. We're now moving back into temporal conditions in the movement of people. What you see right there on the screen is a map of a huge exodus of African-American people, the people that were being the sharecroppers, being the peasants, being the people who knew about the landscape, being the people who lived in the countryside and were nailed to the land, suddenly, starting at about 1918, are completely unhinged from the land. Mass migration between 1918 and 1945 accounts for the movement of 6 million human beings out of the South and into American cities, and we all have a pretty good idea of where they showed up. Cleveland, Detroit, St. Louis, Chicago, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Washington, well, there were southern cities to begin with, Boston, and New York City. What happened when they got there is a big, long, giant story, and I'm not going to tell it. It's a story about adjusting to urban life, of being not just pushed out of the South by the decline and troubles with cotton and violence, but with the pull of industrial jobs that come open for the very first time to non-white workers as a consequence of both industrialization and war production. You really need black laborers to work in factories in a way that never happened before. And from the comparative standpoint of living in the South and being a sharecropper, or living in a city and working in a factory, or doing wage labor, the marginal advantage is just huge. So 6 million people in the space of almost a twinkling of an eye, 40 years, gone. We don't think about African Americans that way, as traveling people, as people who are on the move, as people who are always going from one place to another. But you can, if you remember that before the Civil War, and I'm taking you way back now, over 2 million families were disrupted by an internal slave trade that moved 600,000 people over a period of 40 years from the upper South to the lower South. That forced migrations and voluntary migrations and constantly moving around looking for the better part of freedom is what this whole story is about. We don't think about African American people, we white folks, as anything but out there, somewhere, settled someplace where we don't want to be. What we don't understand is this enormous black odyssey that's taking place inside our country, and which is infused over and over and over again by Jamaicans, Bermudians, Haitians, Goans, Portuguese. The Africanization of African Americans is something that's going on at the same time. And so this is about movement. What happens? People end up in cities. At the same time, we are fighting World War I. Black troops fight in World War I and come home thinking that they've died and fought and bled for democracy. When they get home, when they start heading to places that they think they qualify for as being citizens, they found that the master remains. The law of gravity holds. But in the past several years, I've become very familiar with automatic weapons and giving my life for a country that rejects me. Mass migration will lead to mass murder. Let's go fast. Move to the next slide. You'll see people queuing up to head north. This happens all over railroad stations all over the South. We can move on quickly to the next one. I just wanted to give you a sense of all that. What's that? What you see there is a destroyed black neighborhood. What's happening as this movement begins, as the World War ends, as black migration moves into big cities all over the North throughout 1918 and 1919, white mobs invade at least 27 black communities, all at the same time. Big cities, small towns, with the idea of burning them to the ground and getting the people out of there. It's called the Red Summer of 1918, 1919. It's called the Red Summer because concurrent, remember we have crises always developing around each other. The idea is that following World War I, there is a concern, a constant concern about politicized Central and Eastern European Marxist anarchists, violent people coming to the United States with the idea of overthrowing capitalism. That ends up with the predecessor of the FBI doing raids on urban communities. Can you see the headlines lining up? Put on top of that at the same time, and I'm doing this very quickly, you have to put this together for yourself, and you should be able to certainly by this time. What else are we experiencing exactly this minute? The Spanish flu epidemic of 1918-19 that will kill, over the space of 24 months, 600,000 people. Sound like today? Sure it does. But this again reinforces the point that I think is so important. Don't forget about slavery. Don't forget about the whole atrocity of turning sentient beings and human beings into property with price tags around. But don't let slavery determine your understanding of what's happening in the world today, because what's happening in the world today is 1918 again. Multiple crises living on top of each other. And so when you look at the next slide, what you see is, look at that. I picked this slide for a reason. There's a black guy. The U.S. Army has come to occupy American cities after whites have invaded and blacks have fought back. Remember, I keep talking about arms. Nothing makes white people more disturbed than the idea of armed African-American people doing anything. If you belong to the white militia, you can walk down the street just fine with your sidearm right in front of you. If you're black skin, you better not do that. The point being, however, that arming in defense happens when the white community decides that they don't want to have a black community. So the Red Scare of 1919, the Red Summer, is really a summer of tremendous racial mayhem. Let's see what's on the next slide. Here is the flu bug. I wanted to remind you of the flu bug. Those are just headlines. So people are dying in the streets from microbes and from bullets. And at the same time, the white nation has gone out and fought in World War I and saved the world for democracy. It all fits together in some way that helps us to describe this law of gravity in a way that harmonizes with and counterpoints against where we find ourselves right now. And finally, as we move along here, you know who those guys are? The Klan again, completely reborn in 1920, marching down the mall at the US Capitol. The result of all the things that I'm talking about is this giant Klan revival that goes on starting in the 1950s, sweeps across the United States. It's not just Southern. It's as heavily, at this point, aimed at immigrants who are Catholic, who are foreigners, who are dirty Eastern Europeans, but it's also very much involved with the plain old basic law of gravity, white supremacy. That's, for us, the beginning of what we call the Roaring Twenties. What's behind all this, and what's involved with the other side? We always remember there's a counterpoint. I can only tell you that out of this migration comes one of the most incredible cultural and political and social renaissances that's ever happened in any nation ever. And it happens in New York City, but it happens in lots of places as well, and we inherit all of it. It's called the Harlem Renaissance. If you don't know about it, you're missing some of the greatest literature, poetry, music, theater, and political expression that you can possibly think of. Once African Americans bring their rural roots into the city and begin to develop an urban culture that begins to relate different African American subcultures to each other, and also other subcultures that aren't African American. You end up with Wynton Marsalis. You end up with Lizzo. You end up with Hamilton. The play, the film. I'm only suggesting to you, Toni Morrison. Underneath all this is a tremendous renaissance of African American thinking, and it's all designed to enrich American democracy and tell us what we don't know. And we forget about it. And we assume that someone like Lizzo appears out of thin air without any Ella Fitzgerald, without any Bessie Smith, Big Mama Thornton. You guys probably don't know what I'm talking about, but that's okay.